guys, welcome back to Ancient Amnesia Podcast. Back for a quick clip show. Josh, your host. Thanks for being here. There's some new material we've been posting on the page I wanted everyone to stay updated with, and it's overarching theme that we're going to be presenting on a few podcast shows in the upcoming months. So I wanted to toss out some quick vids on some articles that we're going to be reviewing and then also talking about it in a larger sense. So the intelligence of plants. Very interesting subject. I think that everyone has a sense of communication with plants, wherever your belief is on the spectrum of whether you believe that plants and us share only a biochemical relationship, or those that believe that plants are actually communicating with them mentally and actually in more of a real sense of communication. Wherever you are on that spectrum, you should have some level of at least intimacy with trees and nature and the way it feels when you're in the woods. And all of us growing up as kids probably enjoyed climbing trees or saw trees as friendly creatures to a certain degree. And this is then further visualized when we look at movies like Avatar or The Lord of the Rings, when we have these concepts and mythologies bring in our mind into this idea that we have the ability to communicate directly, or that trees can actually, talk to us in some kind of psychic sense or actual literal sense. So where that is on the spectrum, what does science say about this stuff? We're going to kind of read an article today and then just clip it off and continue to do some more that are going to enlighten this idea further. But brought to us by the Paris Review, the intelligence of plants. What if plants are smarter than we think? A lot smarter. A few years ago, Monica Gagliano, an associate professor in evolutionary ecology at the University of Western Australia, began dropping potted mimosa plants. She used a sliding steel rail that guided them to 6 inches above a cushioned surface, then let them fall. The plant, which is leafy and green with pink-purple flower heads, is commonly known as a shame plant or a touch-me-not because its leaves fold inward when it is disturbed. In theory, it would defend itself against any attack, indiscriminately perceiving any touch or drop as an offense and closing itself up. So it is a defense mechanism that this plant is using to protect itself, and this would be, by science's terms, built into its genetic code through eons of experience over and over and over. So as she dropped the plants, she dropped 56 of them, and then the measured height that they responded as expected. So she measured a certain height and then got the response of them closing, as the defense mechanism is natural to them to do so. She dropped each of them 60 times in 5-second intervals. Eventually, all of them stopped closing. So in real time, the plants kind of stopped behaving normally. She continued like this for 28 days, but none of them ever closed up again. It was only when she bothered them differently, such as by grabbing them, that they reverted to their usual defense mechanism. She concluded in a study that was published in 2014 that the shame plants had remembered that they're being dropped from such a low height and it wasn't actually a danger, and they realized they did not need to defend themselves. In her eyes, her experiment helped prove that brains and neurons are a sophisticated solution, but not necessary requirement for learning. And that is interesting. And that's what I think that this podcast is going to be about as we get into this with some guests, is that, our idea that intelligence has to come from processes that we consider only human, a brain, neurons, and certain levels of complexity in this. But that could not be true, and that could not be true in a lot of ways. And I think it's going to kind of surprise you, what science is out there kind of proving that. The plants, she reasoned, were learning. The plants, she believed, were remembering. Bees, for instance, forget that what they've learned after just a few days. These shame plants have remembered for nearly a month. The idea of a plant intelligence, an intelligence that goes beyond adaptation and reaction and into the realm of active memory and decision-making, has been in the air since at least the early 70s. A shift from religion to spirituality in the 60s and 70s unlocked new avenues of belief. The 1973 bestseller, The Secret Life of Plants, catalyzed the phenomenon. This book claimed that plants can read human minds, feel stress, and pick out bad people. And so since then, it's been kind of wrapped in pseudoscience. And the authors said that they were proven by experiments. So enter the scene Clive Baxter. Clive Baxter was a polygraph tester for the CIA. He did an experiment in 1966 on a whim, and he touched a galvanometer, a machine that registers electrical currents, to a drachnae, a tropical palm houseplant. Silently, Baxter imagined the plant was on fire, and the galvanometer flickered. Baxter concluded that the plant was feeling stress from his thoughts. Could the plant have been reading his mind? In another experiment, Baxter had a friend stomp on a plant. Then that friend and 5 other human suspects walked out in front of the plant that had witnessed the stomping. The plant was hooked up to a galvanometer. When the killer entered the room, the plant sent out a wave of electricity, thereby identifying the murderer. Is this true? Can we, are plants actually kind of reading our behavior? Are they able to pick up on intent? And what does that say about intelligence? And what does that say about consciousness? Richard Fortey, a former professor of paleobiology at Oxford and paleontologist at the Natural History Museum in London, scorns the idea of smart plants. No surprises. It is so anthropomorphized that it is really not helpful, he told Smithsonian. See, my response to that is that the idea of intelligence itself, he is anthropomorphizing, because he is saying that it can only come about through the natural means that humans have it. So I feel that he's doing the same thing, and he's actually being a little self-contradictory there. Trees do not have will or intention, he says. They solve problems, but it is all under hormonal control, and it evolved through natural selection. Now, that's not true if the other researcher could see this happen in real time over a month. So they wouldn't have the ability to then pass these hormones or create these new subcellular kind of genetic codes to understand what's going on. This is real time. He claims that the magical notions of plant intelligence are worrisome because people immediately leap to faulty conclusions, namely that trees are sentient beings like us. But while it's easy to dismiss lonely men conducting electrical experiments on their houseplants and savvy authors taking advantage of gullible public, there may actually be in fact some truth to the idea. Even Darwin floated the first modern ideation of plant intelligence in 1880. And people may understand that Darwin was not a strict, non-spiritualist. I mean, Darwin was a theist and didn't see evolutionary theory that he was co-authoring as the end-all, or was it going to erase this idea of God or a conscious or a living kind of system that I think that people believe. So him writing in The Power of Movement in Plants, he concluded that the root of a plant has the power of directing the movements of the adjoining parts and thus acts like the brain of one of the lower animals. The brain being seated within the anterior end of the body, receiving impressions from the sense organs and directing the several movements. Darwin was talking about how plants react to shifts in vibrations, sounds, touch, humidity, and temperature. But these are just adaptive reactions. Facing toward the sun or closing at a touch does not require quasi-neurological abilities. There is no processing or choice involved, unlike the apparent memory shown in Gagliano's experiment. Many of the ancient Greeks, like Plato and Anaxagoras, Democritus, and Empedocles, shared the belief that plants have a certain kind of brain where sensitivities could be processed. Recently, more findings have seemed to support, or at least point toward, a more restrained version of plant intelligence. Plants may not be capable of identifying murderers in a lineup, but trees share their nutrients and water via underground networks of fungus through which they can send chemical signals to other trees, alerting them of danger. Peter Wolbein, a forest ranger for the German government, has written extensively on trees, about diseases or insects or droughts. When he came across a tree stump that had been felled probably half a millennium ago, he realized, scraping at it and seeing that it was still bright green beneath, that the trees around it had been keeping it alive, sending it glucose and other nutrients. This plant communication systems work similarly to the nervous system of animals. Trees can send out electrical pulse signals underground as well as signals through the air via pheromones and gases. When an animal, for instance, begins chewing on a tree's leaves, the tree can release an ethylene gas into the soil, alerting other trees, whereupon those nearby trees can then send tannins to the leaves so that if they too get their leaves chewed, they might be able to poison the offending animal. So when you look at a forest, you have to look at basically a living system of family. They're all watching each other and they're communicating through the mycelium that's in the soil that's connecting them all together. So there's this kind of coexisting system going on between mycelium and the tree roots and the trees themselves, and they're all actually communicating. Trees can differentiate between threats as well. They can respond differently to a human breaking off one of its branches than they do an animal eating at them. With the former, it will try to heal. With the latter, it will try to poison. Plants even share space with one another. In a 2010 study, when 4 sea rocket plants were put in the same pot, they shared their resources, moving their roots to accommodate the others. If the plants were just acting evolutionarily, it would follow that they would compete for resources. Instead, they seem to be thinking of the other plants and deciding to help them. Even the slightest possibility of a proven plant intelligence would have massive scientific and existential implications. If plants can learn and remember, as Gagliano believes, then humans may have been misunderstanding plants and ourselves for all of history. This common understanding of plant intelligence would have to be reimagined, and we'd have missed an entire universe of thought happening all around us. Intelligence is really the central question in all of this. What precisely is it? Must the ability to remember, learn, decide, and come from neurons and a brain as we tend to think of it? Or should we broaden the definition to include a mindless mastery? The crux of the question rests on whether we think we are at the center of the universe and that our mechanisms for remembering and learning are superior. Or might we be willing to see that there are other non-neurological modes of thought? And might we be willing to decenter ourselves and view the environment through a non-human lens? Plants, as Gagliano concluded, might have a far greater sentience than we'd ever thought possible. The implications of plants that remember being dropped and decide if it's safe to not protect themselves aren't the best expressed in anthropomorphic terms, but we don't know yet if they have another language. In truth, we know so little even about ourselves. Our science cannot fully explain how humans learn and remember. Why not consider that plants have been doing the same for far longer than we have been around, and with an intelligence that is radically different than ours? I think it was a great article. We are going to scan over in the next couple shows and talk about morphic resonance and mycelium, and we're going to kind of tie in these two things together to show you that there's other research that is going to support this stuff, and it's going to give a different angle at this. And I think at the end, we're going to have a greater picture of what we mean by plant intelligence and what modern science is showing as it's starting to emerge and learn. So we hope you enjoyed the show. Please stick around. Go to our Facebook page, Ancient Amnesia. Go to our discussion group to join the conversation, and check us out at our home at ancientamnesia.com. We hope you're enjoying the shows. Stay tuned, and we'll see you soon.